Jonathan Millard, an academic and co-chair of the Oxford African Conference, is joining me on Google Hangout to talk about emerging African market Nigeria. Now, Jonathan, in April, Nigeria rebased its GDP. What does this mean?
I think others have said it really means nothing when it comes down to a change that's mostly on paper. For those that are poor and suffering in Nigeria, which represents the vast majority of the population, this doesn't mean they're going to get any better delivery of services. For those that are wealthy, this doesn't mean they're any more likely to be able to get debt financing on their house. So really, in that respect, it really has no impact at all. It's not going to improve the electricity, it's not going to improve the water delivery, education, healthcare, all these things that are vitally important for Nigeria to get moving on. Some have speculated that maybe perhaps now Nigeria will be able to take on a lot more debt because as a larger GDP base, its debt to GDP ratio has shrunk considerably. The economists I've spoken to in Nigeria have suggested that that probably won't be the case because due to previous debt crises that the government has faced, they're a bit skeptical about taking on the type of international debt that they might now be able to tap into to invest in these important things around infrastructure.
All right, so debt is one of the reasons that Nigeria would update their GDP. Well, but why update it now? I mean, it's been a really long time since it's been updated, so why now?
Yeah, I mean, it has. It's been since 1990 was the last time the update happened, and during that period, there's been a military dictatorship, and then two successive sort of democratic, quasi-democratic governments that are elected. I think you have to look at this in terms of like the broader narrative of Nigeria, in that over the last say 8 to 10 years in particular, they've had two very professional, highly qualified central bank governors who've been doing a lot of work to do reform within the banking sector. In the last 6 years, or 5 or 6 years, they've had a finance minister that is, a top notch. She was nominated to be the head of the IMF. This sort of general push within the country to really sort of get things right, get the environment into a place where investors can actually take a look, do analysis on the data. I think this GDP rebasing should really be looked as a part of that.
Now, do you think other African countries will follow suit?
Yes, absolutely. The problem in Nigeria, as it was in Ghana when Ghana rebased in, I believe, 2011, is that it's used the same sort of boilerplate GDP basing format that was given by the World Bank, more or less, and has been the same in almost every single African country. So one can imagine that almost all countries in sub-Saharan Africa, maybe excluding South Africa, have this same problem. Kenya's already said that they plan on doing it, and they'll be doing that, I think, in September this year. And I think, as time goes on, we'll see different countries choose, based on what might be most advantageous to them, the timing of when they do this rebasing.
You previously wrote that in 2005 to 2006, Nigeria used its figures to claim poverty as part of a debt forgiveness plan. Now, why and how was this allowed?
Yeah, I mean, I think, if I'm really honest, I think probably the key driver of that was guilt on behalf of the West. The policies that were implemented in the 1980s and 1990s by the World Bank and the IMF, with the backing of Western governments, really did a big number on a lot of African economies. To their credit, as time went on, the World Bank did come in and start encouraging a better look at economies in terms of taking a micro view and sort of trying to solve all of the issues of the social programs that they gutted and trying to sort of reinforce those as time went on. But I mean, even into the early 2000s, the picture was very, very bleak, and this sort of really positive growth story we're seeing today about Africa simply wasn't there. So I think everyone was aware that there was this problem in GDP rebasing that was needed, but there was sort of the politics behind the whole thing was that these countries are poor. They were done, a very bad job was done in sort of restructuring them. At least sort of in the initial years, it was a very naive approach, and as a result of that, somehow it was a fair and just thing to forgive these debts.
Now, Now, with this new GDP and Nigeria emerging as Africa's most promising economy, what kind of challenges will the government face on the world stage?
I think they've got huge challenges. They have a huge reputation problem at the moment. I think as most are aware, they have a huge issue with what some have described as a civil war going on in the north of the country, led by the militant group Boko Haram, that is by no means under control. I think most people when they hear Nigeria incorrectly associate the main export being internet scams. You have examples in South Africa even of the negative reputation of a place like Little Lagos. I think that I think this is something that they really need to work hard to overcome, and I hope that they're able to do so. But when they're going to sit around the international table and demand to get into sort of some of these more powerful elite clubs like the G20, or they're now part of the MINS countries, like South Africa was part of the BRICS countries. As we start to look at those types of clubs, people are, first going to have the negative impression that there's a PR problem, which isn't an actual, it's not that Nigeria is a bad country or Nigerians are bad people, but the PR problem is there, which they first need to overcome. And then after that, they're going to need to overcome all of these challenges of why, answering the questions, why have they not addressed their infrastructure problems, particularly when it comes to electricity, education, healthcare, these types of things, which they now very clearly have had the money to do, and they haven't done.
Do you think they will overcome this in the foreseeable future, or do you think it's going to be an ongoing struggle?
I believe they will. I believe they have a very tough election ahead of them in 2015, which I think will set the stage for what happens in the next 5 to 10 years. But a lot of the people I speak to in Nigeria are very positive about progress on things like electricity and refinery of fuels within the country. The cement industry is something that's picked up quite a bit. So they're starting to develop an industrial capacity outside of oil and gas. But it's going to be a very challenging and difficult journey. And I think a lot of it's going to come down to who's in government and how effective they are in implementing these very challenging policies.